question really, and I'm not actually going to ask Celine what the point of the paper.
Why ask that question?
I'll tell you, I can tell you.
I especially thought it was really interesting, this idea that the name Picasso kind of clears space for an openness to other traditions. And in fact, I'd like to thank all the panelists for your paper. It's very, very interesting and a really appropriate way to end this conference. What I want to address in my comment is a concern I have that every time that we try to save non-Western art from this idea of imitation, it seems to me increasingly that what we're actually doing is to just displace that primacy of Europe and reiterate the same kind of historical narrative that allows T.J. Clark, for example, to write. You cited him saying what makes Picasso
the leading artist of the world.
Blah, blah, blah. What concerns me here is this idea that there is such a thing as an absolute artist, and that we try to make the artists that we're working on conform to that model. And I was wondering if you could address that. And
Well, maybe I'll go first. Well, in the manifesto of the Baghdad group, Picasso is described, identified as Fan al-Asr or something. I don't remember the exact Arabic, but he's described as the artist of the century, and so it's just nice that it works nice rhetorically within my paper for T.J. Clark to make the same claim, but to define. But
This just means T.J. Clark is in 1958. That's okay.
Yeah,
He's just in 1958.
But I would say that my point here is not to save non-Western art or to come up with some alternative history. I mean, I work on Jawad Salim because I write about this scene where there's this encounter with this older history of painting that returns, and that return occurs, through the reproduction, through these picture magazines, which emerged at the time, through a reproduction, and it's restaged in the modern artwork. So there's this recovery of a lapsed tradition, of a vanished tradition, but displaced. And it does something important that I write about in my book. This is my interest. I'm not trying to save non-Western art, but yeah, that's what I would say.
I am trying to save non-Western art. I recognize that trap. And I'm like, always falling into it, specifically with Picasso, and I'm like, he's so awesome, and I just want him to speak for himself, but then I put words in his mouth. You know what I mean? I recognize that within my own work because I get so excited about, maybe over-politicizing him in a certain way, or, like Dr. Jones was saying, over-localizing him in a certain way, because I want him, and in a way, I take his words, maybe that excitement sort of makes me read into his words a certain thing that maybe is sort of simplifying him, I guess, in a certain way, because he does talk about, in contrast to Jawad Salim, who's this more cosmopolitan, more sort of out there, is that a way to say it? But he's more vocalized about, taking it away from, like you were saying, away from just going to the countryside. Because Picasso was very much an instigator in that whole process. He took people out to the countryside and said, let's, draw the peasant and let's engage with this localized environment. I mean, he was part of that, and Jawad Salim reacted against that. He wanted to say, well, this isn't enough to, take these trips and have these, exhibitions in a home. He wasn't okay with that. He wanted to sort of take it to a broader context. Where I think Faik Hassan was more interested in the education of Iraqis on the Iraqi playing field, I guess. But in a sense, he wanted to engage with internationalism by saying our art is as good as your art, and here's how it is, because I've been educated and I've educated my students, and I mean, he's very much known as a teacher, as a master. So, you know, I tried to be conscious of not trying to save him from obscurity, and maybe in a certain way I kind of feel sorry for Faik Hassan, because yes, he's seen as a master, and yes, he's seen as the teacher and the one of the fathers, I guess, going back to that sort of family metaphor. But Jawad Salim is seen as the Iraqi artist, you know, the Picasso of Iraq, right? And sort of eclipses Faik Hassan. And I think in choosing him as a topic for research, I wanted to save him from that shadow, you know? So I acknowledge that.
And I think as an empirical project, it's a good one. I mean, there's certainly nothing wrong with it, and you did a good job of
Thank you.
saving him, so to speak.
Oh, thank you. I hope to do more of that, saving him. Go ahead.
I think for me, the question of comparison with Europe, it's very interesting as a historiographic question that people continue to sort of say things like the Picasso of wherever. For example, Bedirahme Ebolu, Picasso of Turkey, for example. But I think what's more interesting for me is the way in which these artists are using international languages in order to address local issues, and they're really functioning in order to develop a market. The director of the School of Fine Arts in the mid-30s said something along the lines of art needs to be as useful as a refrigerator, because otherwise people won't buy it. And so they're functioning with it, and I love that quote because it really says we need to make art function in an everyday way that people can relate to and feel a need for. And I think that one of the things that happens in terms of the history of art is that it's always based on this issue of innovation and the next style and bringing it forward and bringing it forward. But this artist is trying to create a social revolution of some sort. And modernism, academicism, and each of them is invested in this social revolution. So what is revolutionary? If you're too avant-garde to have an audience, you actually can't be social revolutionary. So there's a certain place where there's a choice there, and I think the artists are making a choice by living in their countries, by trying to construct an audience. And that dynamic is much more interesting than the question of were they great artists or not, were they as good as the West, and so on and so forth, which ultimately, a lot of the art, I don't think it's great or inspiring, but I think it's really fascinating. And those are two different things for me.
And if I could, I really appreciate the question, and I really appreciate some of these responses, because I think you need to look to any locality. What are the discourses that are being deployed on the ground, and what is their strategic purpose? So for someone in Paris, they might want to use, heaven forbid, Russian modernism in order to critique the studio, the boudoir, the continued obsessions of the French situation. So never forget that these supposed centers have their own players who are contesting, what this thing is, this modernism thing. I do think that, here's what I want as your audience, I want, for example, Faik's, I want to see his studies. I want to see him working out this cuneiform thing, because it doesn't work for me to just see it. It just doesn't work for me to just see it superimposed on the painting. I'm like, and then the boxes shift, and then the cells shift. I mean, I'm just following you. And if it's an argument about intention, I'm hoping to see the good stuff there.
Right.
And, for you, I wish, Olympia, I mean, that painting is a recumbent female with a cat. It's not just Picasso. In other words, the guy is syncretizing everything. He's bringing it all down. It's Matisse, it's, the clay, that his brother puts Paul Klee there with his little Tunisian travels. I mean, in other words, he's bringing the whole goddamn army of Western modernists' Orientalism into his painting. And then you have to figure out what he's doing with it. In other words, I'm not telling you how to read it, I'm just saying they're all in the room, so you got to deal with it.
But do you have a method for how to go about tracing this? Because you can't rigorously like determine, because we don't have, in our case, we don't often have access to sketches, notebooks.
Well, you've got his
We're working
brother's
with
book from the 70s, which is awesome. You've got the magazine he's reading. He's reading that illustration. What other illustrations are around? What else do they illustrate Monet with his cat? Maybe he saw Monet's Lady with a Cat when he was in Paris, possibly. I mean, in other words, T.J. Clark's writing about Monet's Woman with a Cat in the 70s. I mean, in other words, these are formations that are clearly affecting the guy. Sometimes you can be sure, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can only say, hey, a reader in Paris would have looked at this and said, whoa, Olympia, a new Olympia, a Baghdadi Olympia, right? So it's like, do not be afraid of these influences, welcome them in the room because these guys were, and then show how they're wrestling with them. That is the agon that makes this so fascinating. You know, knowing that there's a different kind of cubism that's going to be brought in for this political purpose versus that cubism brought in for that political purpose, that is fascinating stuff. And European, the hegemon, needs to hear that. It's because it will change how they read their own histories of MoMA or something.
Wait, can I just respond to this before?
Yeah.
Sorry, just one quick thing. Well, first of all, I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an art historian, and I'm not equipped to do that iconographic
No,
work.
you're in the
And
room.
secondly,
You're in the
okay,
room.
I'm in the room. I'm in the room. But also, I don't
Walk
think.
the walk.
Okay, I'm gonna walk the walk. But I don't think I cannot satisfactorily kind of do it. So I try to, as I said, not to ask the question of influence, to go around it by trying to identify something in the painting, right? Not talk about the iconography of the woman, but try to look at its pictorial structure. And do we find here
shifting
something
to
that...
Wasiti as influence. I mean, you're not moving out of influence. You're just saying it's Wasiti.
And there's also another issue there, which is that people aren't always transparent. That is, he might say, oh, I'm really influenced by Wasiti, but he can also be influenced by Picasso and Klee and not really want to talk about those for a variety of reasons.
But
Right,
his
which-
brother wants to talk about them, which
Right.
is pretty
But
interesting
it might,
in itself.
but I mean, I think they're serving two different purposes. That is, I think the I'm Wasiti is saying I'm authentically Arab. The
No.
shift to no, wait, let me finish.
Yeah, but I'm just going to say that.
But I mean, it gives him a certain relationship with the past, at least, or a way of reconstructing the past. I think that comparison with Picasso, it's significant that his brother is doing it and not him, because he's saying he's as great as Picasso and Klee and these Western guys. So I think there are two different claims that can be made in each of these, and I'm not saying that is what he's doing. I'm saying that you can't always trust that the artist is completely self-transparent about their work, either to themselves or to their audiences, because the artist is also presenting
It's a
themselves.
strategist.
Yeah.
Right. So Nambi was, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I was going to also suggest another type of methodology is to deal with the scale of the local. The region could be an interesting place to look at rather than just Baghdad, Istanbul, and Baghdad would have been an interesting comparison. But also getting out of the binary, Baghdad versus Paris. If you introduced a third category,
Those
you know,
Poles,
Baghdad,
those
Istanbul,
Polish guys.
sorry?
And those Polish guys are a third category.
Yes, there's, but you know, we use it as a methodology. So you know, get out of that. I think both of your papers, for me, as you pointed out, were very traditional. It was old art history. Unfortunately, you
In
almost-
what, reinforcing the binary?
Because the
it was
formal.
the
reading.
binary.
The formal
It's the sort of the Oriental essence, the Baghdadi character. It's I think a lot of questionable categories were there with all the
Okay.
good intentions of obviously.
I just want to, may I?
But also I wanted to say one small thing about the painting you're discussing. There was an axe in the middle of that painting.
I don't
It's
know.
not an axe, I think it was a fan.
Yes, it's a
fan.
fan, absolutely. I think it's a fan.
fan.
I think it goes
Or a
back
fan.
to the
Fan,
Olympia
yeah.
and everything. But it's
Anger.
yes, odalisque.
He's got the
Serious
fans going
fan.
on there.
But it also looks like an axe.
It does look like an axe.
So Baltadrolda comes to mind.
But it's pink. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot.
But this is very old art history. This kind of Panofsky, identify what's in it and refer it to these different. That's
You know, my recommendation is use it all.
Yes, you
Yeah.
know.
Use it all. Some of it's going to end up in
It's not about
footnotes.
things.
but-
How do you say that? You said it wasn't about things.
Pictorially, I would argue that it's
I
not
thought it was
possible.
about things.
In what way?
These are probably best discussed after the group conversation. But Tiffany wanted to say.
I just wanted to sort of address that, your comment there. Thank you for, we need these challenges for sure. And I think what I'm trying to do is not necessarily, my point was that I think within the scholarship that I've been exposed to about Iraqi art, and specifically about Faik Hassan, there's just this repetitive reference to, oh, this is Cubist, this is Impressionism. And what I'm trying to do is to shatter that and to say, wait, okay, yes, there is this influence. Acknowledge the influence, certainly, because they are, as Dr. Jones was saying, in the room. But what else is in the room? There are other things in his, psychological, metaphorical room that we're not bringing to the table necessarily. And I think we have a tendency within what I've been exposed to within the scholarship to sort of talk around the work of art instead of saying, let's look at it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
a lot of what I'm doing
that's
is not,
crucial.
a lot of what I'm doing is not necessarily making definitive inclusions. Certainly not. I'm not an expert. I have a lot of work to do, and I certainly am ready to do it, right? What I wanted to do was just say, what if? Let's look at this. Let's see if there's anything that we can pull into the conversation formally that might sort of suggest
Yes,
a localized
can I
origin.
also say one more thing? By the 1950s
Oh, sorry.
in Istanbul, in Turkey, you have a huge reaction against Cubism.
Yeah.
Huge
Right.
reaction. There's a whole war going on there.
Of course.
Anti-Cubist movement. In a way, Baghdad is picking up a movement that is already quite old for the region.
But I think they're
What does
doing
that
it
mean?
for different. I think they're doing it for different purposes. And there are two things which were coming up. One of them is that you kept the words influence keep coming up, and it's not only about influence of the artists per se, but it's also how the historiography has inscribed these artists into narratives which produce a repetition of modernism, which actually I find, and this was my argument, of course, erases the agency of the artists in their present tense.
Right,
So
that's a great
yeah.
lesson.
And that's one issue. The other issue is that I don't know what the commissions of some of the works are, if they're major works, but I was really showing the early work of the D group in this paper, but the later work of the D group, as they get more establishment, gets much more invested with scenes of the village that kind of look Hittite-ish. And so really what they're doing shifts to a much more nationalist trend, and this has to do with a lot of the state commissions and a lot of bank commissions. And so there's a big shift which takes place, which also varies that narrative.
If I would just interject before Avina, because 1958 was a seminal date for
Absolutely.
Iraq. And so the
Absolutely.
pre and post 1958 makes a difference of what Faik Hassan was doing versus what Jawad Salim was doing prior. And so I think that, an issue that would have added some dimension if you mentioned.
Okay, great.
And
I'm going to just keep us moving because behind you is one that's been up for a while. Yeah.
Well, first, thank you. I must say thank you for the panel because it was a very inspiring one, and the paper are still working in my head. The discussion is now another thing, I must say, because if I just heard the jargon that you are using here in this discussion, we are totally Eurocentric, we are totally Western, we are using the
We're in New York.
we're
in New York,
using
just
all the
not old York, but
vocabulary
New York.
of our memory, visual memory of Eurocentric art history in order to speak about artists from Baghdad. But that's another case. But I really like actually the idea of looking now at Cubism and looking even at Picasso as a paradigm, not even as not an influence, not at all. I don't want to, to discuss it in this term, but as a kind of a paradigm to understand what is going on. Because Cubism is not born in a specific moment, and it lives, and it still actually lives in art history along the 20th century. So we are looking at a different moment of Cubism. And as Nada said just right now, the 50s, Cubism is not to compare with the Cubism that Wendy was talking at the beginning. So you had a different moment of Cubism, and especially with the beginning of the Cold War, there is a totally different approach to Cubism in the West and in the Levant, in the Middle East. I was working on a Palestinian artist, Abed Abdi, who was also working within the paradigm of Cubism, I would say, but he was educated in Dresden of East Germany and brought back actually the communist idea, where Cubism was the paradigm and the avant-garde for a communist idea, socialist communist idea, vis-a-vis the abstract going on in New York at that time, which that's actually lying out
But
of
Cubism, remember, did not leave the figure, never left the figure.
Yes, but the
So-
figure was part of an ideology that the
Absolutely.
socialist communists
So this was part of the
but
comment-
vis-a-vis the abstract.
This is part of the comment I was
in
making.
America.
If we look at morphology alone, what's going on in Durham, North Carolina is the same as what's going on in Baghdad. So morphology doesn't help us. We have to do those close readings, but in order to anchor it in the ground, in order to do the genealogy, studied in Dresden, studied in Paris, looked at Wasidi, didn't look at Wasidi, so the morphologies are just, like your guy was saying, skins, envelopes. And so our job as historians is to find the grittiness of difference, which may not exist in the form. It may not. It may exist in the reception. It may exist in what people bring to it, in their communities of reception. So there were many other questions. You had one.
Yeah. So I have a question actually specifically about the D group artists. So looking at the Cubist paintings, I also saw a lot of Fauvist elements, but I really don't want to misassign. So I was wondering if you thought of it as kind of these artists also engaging and actively working with Fauvism, or if it's kind of a product of their working with Cubism and something else entirely.
Well, Bedirahme Eyüboğlu is known to have been very much influenced by Raoul Dufy, and so that he didn't work very much with Cubism at all, even though he was one of the leaders of the D group. And the association with Cubism, I think, is much broader. I think that they're not using the word Cubism in the same way we're imagining. I think that it's a sort of complicated relationship, because if you look at the thing called Impressionism that the academic artists do, it doesn't look like Impressionism either. And so that stuff is called Impressionism, and what comes later is called Cubism. And it's just a use of a label that produces a modernist historiography, but some of it is Cubist influence, but some of it is not Cubist influence, and some of it is, again, takes its resources in multiple ways. For example, Cemal Tollu is a very interesting, let's say Nurullah Berk and Cemal Tollu. Nurullah Berk takes his breakdown of space and relates it very much to carpet patterns. And as we saw in some of the images I showed, Cemal Tollu is very much interested in this use of other cultures. In another work, which I think I showed, he has a picture of a teacher, and in the background there's a Japanese screen. And so he's very conscious of this appropriation of different cultures. Then in his later work, he tends to affiliate this with Hittite-ish looking things, whereas other people are much more interested in village scenes. There's also an artist named Turgut Zaim, he's a rather naive artist who does village scenes. And so they're all really it really has to do with what Peyami Safa said, which is they all are looking differently. They are not advocates of a style. But I think what's interesting is how that association progresses, because Cubism isn't what Cubism is. You know, this isn't a cubism in which people are breaking down space or interested in any of that stuff. It's another way of thinking about modernism. So when they say Bediüzzaman is the Turkish Picasso, what they mean isn't that he's breaking down space, but that he's innovative with what he's doing. It's a much broader sensibility.
Picasso as a paradigm, Picasso as a space.
Other
is what you were
questions?
saying.
Pamela?
What is the word in Arabic for cubism?
تكعيبية.
Yeah.
What is that?
التكعيبية. تكعيبية. From
Is it Iraqi?
I mean, I'm trying to. التكعيبية. التكعيبية. From مكعب تكعيبية. So it's cubism, literally exactly the same.
Actually, it's an Arabic word.
Cubism, yeah.
Yeah.
Who knew?
So, thank us all.
The reason why I asked that question of the translation in Arabic is because I'm wondering if there's something about Cubism, not just because Picasso is the most famous artist in the world and more famous than Matisse, but because Cubism has something to do with some of those medieval manuscripts, like the Timurid style of Bezod, when the viewpoint, of the viewer constantly changes. So the viewer is like a ghost,
yeah.
Having access to the bottom and to the top of the ceiling of the building and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering if this fascination, maybe he was influenced by Matisse in that piece, right?
The odalisque. I mean, here's how I think you can approach this art historically. Look at the 1910 show not as a sudden invention of modernism's interest in the non-Western. Oh, 1910, that must have made Cubism happen with Picasso. But rather, the 1910 exhibition is coming out of the same secessionist impulses that propel Picasso to Paris, that propel him to break with the Academy, by painting Demoiselle and moving on this trajectory, which he needs Braque to join him, c'est ma femme, right? Maybe Braque went to the 1910 show, right? I don't know, but the point is, these are coming out of huge tectonic changes that are in play in Europe itself. So Cubism is interested in those manuscripts. If not specifically, then generically. Cubism is interested in breaking with the Academy. And it's not just Renaissance space, it's the Academy. So, and this goes back to Talin's, again, offline discussion I had with her last night, where these avant-garde movements why are they brought into these local situations? Because they produce a certain kind of publicness, a certain kind of Öffentlichkeit. This would be where I would begin. They produce a non-state, non-academy, non-living room only, non-painted for my aunt's bedroom kind of space. For discussion, for producing new modern subjects. I mean, these are accidents of history that then become deployed and fully materialized in certain kinds of paintings and certain kinds of discourses. So what's so fascinating is how different they are in these different situations and in these different generations, right? How the same morphology can be inhabited and propelled into meaning so differently in these many different domains. Shall we conclude with thanks to the organizers and to the Dworkin Center and to the